you know, their morality, their willingness, their want, and their desire, um, another huge part of why someone engages in helping or not helping also deals with the situation. Okay. And so the main thing I hope to get out of these couple of lectures on pro-social behavior is when you see someone who's not engaging or engaging in helping behavior, that if they don't, you don't leave it to, ooh, they're an awful person for not helping out. Um, and wonder what are some situational variables. What is it about the situation that may be just as a contributor to a person helping or not helping than the type of person they are. Okay. And on the other end, when people engage in helping behavior, um, you may want to think about what was it about the situation that helped them feel like they could engage in helping behavior instead of giving them more of that hero status. Because our goal would be to create more people who help. And if we understand why someone helped versus not helped, it can help us a lot. And really, before we get into the bystander effect. So, bystander effect is helping is dependent upon the number of people that are available to help. It's a basic definition. But what I want to drive home before we move on is this idea of whether people engage in help because they are a moral, helpful person, or do they engage in help based on the situation? Okay. And I think this was elegantly done by a psychologist, Dr. Carter, in 2018. And what he was looking for is not necessarily helping behavior, but whether people engage in behaviors that are against their moral fortitude, given some situational variables. Okay. And so what he did in 2018 is at the beginning of the semester, he had this, what was listed as a single research. It was like a tool validation type of thing, where he measured students' moral fortitude. Okay. Meaning, do they feel, you know, versus, do they feel, you know, the need to help others, the willing that cheating is wrong, those kind of moral things, and people scale somewhere from very low moral to very high moral. Okay, but later in the semester, he invited those original participants to come into and engage in a separate and advertise at the same unrelated research. Okay. And what he did though is he randomly divided them into two basic groups. Okay. In one group, they're going to read a very short story about doing something morally right. Okay. In another condition, or there, I think there was a couple conditions, they read just a short thing, just a story, just a random story of a person or something doing not good or bad. It was a neutral story. Okay. And then a while later, he had them engage in an online game. Okay. That was based on money. The higher score you got, the more money you would receive. Okay. But what he did in the research is he said the computer is going to calculate a score. And then what I want you to do is handwrite your score. Okay. No matter what, the participant was always going to handwrite no, get a score that was lower than the computer. Okay. So the computer was always going to generate a score, which means more money than what the person would calculate. Okay. The moral dilemma is you would assume that a moral, just person would say, no, there's a difference here. I calculated a lower score, and it looks more right, so I should be paid that lower amount. That's what you would assume a moral person would do, right? An immoral person would kind of say, oh, no, 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 the numbers matched, and maybe cross out their thing. And what you would also assume is that the students who scored higher in moral fortitude at the beginning of the semester would be less likely to cheat. Correct? That's kind of the assumptions that you would make. But what he found is something totally different. Okay, is that the students' scores had nothing to do with whether the student cheated or not cheated. Okay, what had to do with the score is if the person read something about somebody doing morally right towards something good versus reading a neutral story just before going and doing that game. Okay. And because what it found is the people who read the neutral one, regardless of whether they scored high in moral fortitude or low in moral fortitude, were more likely to cheat. The individuals, and this is the more kind of interesting part, that read the story about someone doing something good, okay, even the people who scored low in moral fortitude were less likely to cheat, okay. The point being, and the point that I want to drive home from what we talked about on Tuesday and more about what we talk about today, is our attitude and our personality and everything have something to do that puts us in a situation where helping can occur. But that's not the total story of what engages someone to actually help. And one of those examples is the bystander effect. And I think I mentioned this on Tuesday that if you're going to have a heart attack, you should do it in a low populated place versus a high populated place, which is counterintuitive. You think if something happens to you and there's more people around, the more likely you would get help. But it's actually kind of the reverse. If there's less people around, the more likely you'll get help. Okay. And this is what is known as a bystander effect. But it is a little bit more complicated than just simply the number of people who are available. And what has been found since the original research done on this um, has found some nuances in whether or not someone will act as a bystander or get actively involved. Okay. And I should note that this came out of something that happened in New York City in the 1960s or 70s with a case of a lady named Genevieve. Okay. In the middle of a middle class, not high crime community with literally hundreds of people around. There was a lady, her name was Genevieve, who not only was sexually assaulted, when she ran away from her assailant, he would go grab her in the middle of the road and drag her back in the alley and continue to rape her. And he did this 4 or 5 times before killing her. So here we have this exposure of this person being torn in the middle of this busy area, and no one called the police. Okay. And upon interviewing, they found that there was approximately about 36 people who were aware of the incident, but no one called. Okay. And this ignited this research on why, in that situation, did no one call the police? And of course, there was the most obvious one, which is disposition. They assumed that it was the New Yorker attitude that New Yorkers don't get involved, you keep to yourself, you're rough, you're brazen, and you just don't get into any other people's business. And so it was a personality quality of that area. And if you think about that, it's kind of like victim blaming, right? Because we think in our mind, well, I would have called. And so, what is our instant reaction to put psychological distance between us and that person, like we've talked about? We make sure it's about the person. They're rude, they're New Yorkers, it's their personality. Um, but then as research went on, we found it had to do more with the number of people and the situation involved. Okay. So kind of what are the steps to engaging and helping in action when people are in groups is one, everyone needs to notice the event, okay, that it's going on, okay. Where people won't at least consider engaging in help at that point, it depends upon the amount of stimulus the person is receiving. Okay. So in this example, you're more likely to get help in a library than in the middle of a fair. Okay. Why? Because there's not a lot of stimulation, noises, distractions in the library versus all the carnival noises and the people and the laughing and the lights in a carnival. Okay. So the amount of stimulation is the first thing that we've noticed whether a person will notice and then consider helping. Okay. The second thing is interpreted as an actual emergency. Okay. And this is where the issue, the hazard of not engaging in behavior comes down to ambiguity. Whether or not you can identify that situation as an actual emergency, the more ambiguous and not sure you are, of course, the less likely you'll consider again engaging in helping. Okay. The third one is assuming responsibility. Okay. And this actually has to do with the presence of others. And um, there's something we'll talk about here in a few minutes called diffusion of responsibility. If we ourselves think that other people can take care of a problem, we're more likely to walk away thinking that the problem will be taken care of. Okay. This was shown in the original research by Latney and Darley. Okay. Is that what they'd have is usually they had a student who would just randomly do a seizure. And the number of people present went anywhere from 2 people and then up to 7 to 9 people. Okay. And what they found is that most people would engage in helping if there were under 4 people. People would engage in helping at least half the time if there was 5 to about 7 people. Okay. But after 7 to 9 people are present, only about 20% of people actually engage in helping. So this is that notion as the number of people increases, the likelihood of helping decreases. And after the research, the surveys that they did for the majority of the individuals who decided not to participate or to help, is they said, well, there were other people there, so we didn't think our help was needed. And this response became more and more as the number of people present were there. Okay. So that's why I say it's better to have a heart attack at the, what did I say? IRS office where no one wants to go versus the mall. Okay. Um, and then the fourth step is so I feel like I'm there. Maybe there's only a few of us here or a few of us that can actually engage in helping, then we look at the action. Do I have the training and tools to actually help a person? Okay. If we feel like we have that training and tools, then this is when we know action will be engaged. Okay. Or at least at a higher rate than just normal. All right. So first is noticing an event and then interpreting it as something that is an emergency, assuming personal responsibility, assessing your ability, and initiating action. Okay. And this kind of represents that diffusion of responsibility that we talked about. Okay. Is I'm trying to remember how this works. I talked about diffusion of responsibility, and you can kind of see here the number of people that don't engage in helping versus the number that do with group size. But there's also something known as pluralistic ignorance, okay? Is that everyone will look at each other for cues and assume that others know it is not an emergency, okay? And this is something that is kind of a normal human behavior. All right? And I think I brought up in this class what would happen if I jumped on a table and started dancing. Okay. If I was recording you guys, more than likely, before saying I broke it or I went psychotic, you would look to your left and look to your right. Because what you're doing is you're trying to see, am I experiencing what everyone else is, and what is everyone else's reaction before I make a determination? Okay. As group size increases and we look at others who are just standing around, we make that same assumption that if no one else is helping, then that's not a situation that I need to engage in helping. It goes back to um, uh, interpreting the situation as an emergency. As pluralistic ignorance increases, the less likely we are to interpret a situation as needing assistance, especially if it's ambiguous. Okay. And then in the step three is that diffusion of responsibility that we talked about before. Okay. So we also do some calculations. Okay. So in scenario A, let's say one helper is needed. Someone drops a paper, fills out a single survey. The crowd effect actually is activated. Okay. If one person needs help, the bystander rules that we just talked about are apply. Okay. So rationality is low, solidarity, helping is insufficient. Adding your effort to the crowd would be redundant. Okay. However, what we find is when many helpers are needed, such as lifting a car, a complex surgery, or a large-scale survey of some type, where many people are needed, the bystander effect actually is reversed. Helping intentions increase as crowd grows. Okay. Rationality is that if many are needed and you are alone, helping is futile. If a crowd is present, your effort becomes critical, missing piece. Okay. This research and this area of understanding has really went into research on things like crowd behavior, okay, and things like rioting behavior. So if you think about a riot, majority of riots that we see have to do when a group is slighted in some way. Okay, so there's an injury to a community. When there's injury to a community, it requires group action. Okay, so when we look at riots, it may start with one member of the group, but because we understand the situation needs a group effort, it's a cascading effect that one then ignites the behavior in another and another and another, and then you end up with what's the rioting behavior that we see. Okay. Um, and so, but it also expresses how we engage in helping in crowds. Okay. So in situations that need many helpers, um, uh, we're more likely to help. Okay. And this is why in a lot of bystander intervention trainings, when we want people to engage in helping, this is why we train those individuals to go into a situation. And let's say it's a person having a heart attack or cardiac arrest. And so you engage in helping, but one of the things they instantly recommend is start to delegate duties to people. So this is when you're sitting there, maybe starting chest compressions, and you say, you call 911, you do this, you do that, you do this. And while that gets action in those people going, what we find is it gets the crowd more involved, and the crowd starts to be more helpful once someone says, this isn't a problem that one person can solve. This is a problem that needs more people. And that then cascades into a group process instead of just a few people helping out. So that's often taught as one of the bystander interventions if you want to integrate help into and reduce the number of bystanders. We also can look at whether people engage in helping based on cultural influence too. Okay. Um, because a lot of time helping is defined culturally about appropriateness. So here we're looking at the United States versus India, and again, United States is individualistic, so it's norm of self-interest. It's socially inappropriate to champion a cause that does not directly affect you. Okay. And so I remember in the early days of domestic violence movement, and then I got involved in the early days of the contemporary movements for LGBTQ rights and everything like that. And being involved in the domestic violence in the early years that I was there, it was very suspicious of why the agency I worked for hired a male. Okay. And so in order to, whenever they did community events and community fundraisers for the domestic violence agency I worked for, they purposely did not have me go because when they had men there advocating to reduce domestic violence because it wasn't seen as a male cause, it would reduce their donations and reduce their participation. Okay. In fact, I remember the very, very first professional conference I went to, it was on domestic violence and everything like that. And a big old ballroom at the hotel, and it was a lot of people. And I walked in, and I think it's because I wasn't wearing a police uniform. So, I wasn't an officer or something like that. But the first thing I was asked is to go get a table more water and cookies because they assumed I was there as a employee of the hotel rather than of the conference. My point being is that we often have trouble helping because in our culture, it's not appropriate unless you're affected by that. In the example of the LGBTQ communities in the early days in advocating, I think it's colleges and stuff is where I got involved with that. Because again, I wasn't LGBTQ. They had to make a special category called what is it? What are they called? Allies. Okay. So I wasn't part of the movement, and I wouldn't be defined as part of the movement, but I can definitely be an ally. Those people that kind of sit outside of the group that are just kind of there and supportive. Okay. And that is a very culturally based thing because, for example, in India, which is a collective culture, they have they have a cultural norm of absolute requirement to help. Okay, meaning that helping has nothing to do with a cause. It doesn't have to do with who you are. If you're a human, it's expected for you to engage in a cause that is needed, a situation that needs resolved, and those kinds of things. So, a person, for example, a male going and advocating to reduce domestic violence, that would be perfectly normal there. A non-LGBTQ person who's not LGBTQ going and advocating for LGBTQ rights would not be considered abnormal in that context. Okay. So it's kind of a cultural difference. I will say, with continuing generations, we're seeing this effect less and less in the United States over the last couple decades. I think it's become more acceptable for people to be a part of a cause, even if they haven't been or a victim or a member of that given group. So some positive move, I think. Um, so that's another situation in which a person will decide whether they can help or they can't. Is are they a group that I can actually advocate for and make a difference? Okay, so we've talked about that. I think we went over all these. All right, so that is pro-social and helping behaviors, at least what we know about it. Um, uh, is there any questions here in the class?